Hello, this is Jim Amolia for Historical Sketches. The Battle of Waterloo has a ring of familiarity even for those who have a minimal interest in history. It was the military and the political end of Napoleon, as we know, defeated by the army of the English, led by the Duke of Wellington, with the help of the Prussians. As we know, following the defeat at Waterloo on June 18th, 1815, Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic, or St. Helena as they pronounce it in England. Less known are the vicissitudes and the uncertainties that Napoleon went through in the days following the Battle of Waterloo. His travel, or rather his escape, as you see on the map, from Waterloo to the town of Rochefort on the southwest of the French Atlantic coast, his travel, his adventures, and his indecisions read almost like a novel. But how do we know about all this? And this we owe to the diligence of an extraordinary character in the train of Napoleon, the Baron and General Gaspard, as you see in the picture. Gourgaud was the son of a musician in the king's private orchestra at Versailles, the king being Louis XVI, who, as you know, ended up beheaded on the guillotine in 1792. The mother of Gourgaud was a nurse in the service of the Duke de Berry, and therefore Gaspard Gourgaud grew up being a playmate with the Duke. And perhaps it was this association with the nobility that helped drive Gaspard to the famous École Polytechnique of Paris, and then to the equally famous artillery school. Gaspard participated in just about all the battles fought by Napoleon. He distinguished himself at Ulm, at the capture of Vienna, at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Friedland. He saved the day in a critical spot in a battle near Ostrolenka in Poland, and was promoted for his bravery. He then fought in Spain at the siege of Saragossa, and later was back in the north at various other battles, including the famous Battle of Wagram. And during the Russian campaign, Gaspard Gourgaud was wounded, but still he was the first to in Moscow and saved the life of Napoleon by discovering and destroying a mine at the very Kremlin intended to destroy Napoleon himself. For this bravery, he was made a Baron of the Empire, and due to this courage in the terrible retreat from Russia, he was appointed first orderly officer. He then received the Gold Star of the Legion of Honor, and in January 1814, he killed with a pistol shot a terrorist Cossack who was on the point of throwing a dagger into Napoleon. Gourgaud was then wounded again, but he was at Waterloo, and finally it was he who fired the last shot from a French cannon. Baron Gourgaud was one of the restricted circle of people who were allowed to accompany Napoleon in his exile in St. Helena, as we will see later in another sketch. It is also understandable, why Napoleon was attached to him. In St. Helena, Napoleon said of him, "He is my work, he is my son." And the adventures of Baron Gourgaud by no means end in St. Helena. For the moment, suffice to say that besides being so dramatically active in so many battles, he kept good notes, and he also wrote an account of the events from Waterloo to St. Helena. He was not the only one to describe the life of Napoleon at St. Helena. There was also the Count Emmanuel Las Casas, another companion of Napoleon in his exile. But Gourgaud, the notes of Gourgaud have the freshness of one who has lived a dangerous and adventurous life and dives deep and quickly into the core of matters. He has a kind of brutal love for truth, a quality that we should say is extremely hard to find in today's politicians, and particularly in Pentagon bigwigs, many of whom have a brutal love for lying. But let's go back to the aftermath of Waterloo. And here again is the map of Napoleon's travel from Waterloo to the French Atlantic coast. We should add that at the time of Waterloo, Belgium was part of France, as the foundation of the current Belgian state only occurred in 1831. The Battle of Waterloo was fought on Sunday, June 18th, 1815, and this, as you see in the picture, is the monument that commemorates the... On the next day, the day after the battle, June 19th, 1815, Napoleon reached the town of Charleroi, of which you see here the very peaceful main square, and then he proceeded to cross the river Sambre that you see here, peacefully looked at by a group of retired fishermen. And then Gourgaud tried to collect a small body of cavalry, but it was really hard, as we may imagine after a defeat. There was the usual confusion of people escaping and creating a traffic jam. And also there was the imminent danger that the light horse of the enemy may show up at any time. So, instead of using a carriage, it was mandatory for everyone, including Napoleon, to just ride a horse. Now, in the little town of Rocroi, that you see here, in a restaurant or pub, much like this one in the picture, perhaps less the car, they had dinner. And Baron Gourgaud adds and notes down that the restaurant keeper made him pay 300 francs, a price somewhat excessive, he seems to imply. And after Rocroi, they reached Reims, the ancient seat of the coronation of French kings. And you see here in the picture Reims, magnificent Gothic cathedral. On June 20th, they had breakfast at the little town of Berry-au-Bac, again in the picture, a town that suffered tremendous punishment later, 100 years later during World War I. And here, in the little town of Berry-au-Bac, there was a conference, or a consultation of sorts. The idea discussed was for Napoleon to go to Paris, present himself at the Chamber of Deputies, worn as he was and travel-stained, and asked to be put in charge of the still intact army of General Emmanuel de Grouchy, and resign the crown, if resigning the crown would bring peace. And here we must interject a note about the Marquess of Grouchy, you see in the picture, who perhaps bears some partial responsibility for the defeat at Waterloo. Because earlier on, before the final battle, Napoleon had sent him, Grouchy, to pursue a part of the Prussian army that was actually retreating. But at the time, or immediately, Grouchy was unable to close in with the Prussians. Then, despite hearing the cannon sound from nearby Waterloo, he decided to follow the Prussians along the route that initially was literally specified in his orders. But in the meantime, the Prussians and the British armies united to crush Napoleon. But still, we can say actually Grouchy won a smart victory over the Prussian army. The Prussian army that he was ordered to chase on June 1815, but it was too late. By the time this battle was over, Napoleon had already lost at Waterloo. And as far as resistance was possible after the great disaster of Waterloo, Grouchy made it. He gathered up the wrecks of Napoleon's army and retired swiftly and unbroken to Paris, where, after interposing his reorganized forces between the enemy and the capital, he resigned his command into the hands of another French marshal. For the record, the poor Grouchy was left to defend himself, we could say, for having followed orders, and the French condemned him to exile in America. But he returned to France in 1821, the same year when Napoleon died in St. Helena, and Grouchy was reinstated as a general. But let's return to Napoleon himself. From the town of Berry-au-Bac, that we discussed before, where the Napoleon entourage had breakfast, they moved to the historic town of Laon, of which you see again here the beautiful cathedral. And here Napoleon was recognized in the street, and the people shouted, "Vive l'Empereur! Hail to the Emperor!" And the peasants surrounding the little train of Napoleon offered themselves to defend him to their death. From Laon, Napoleon proceeded finally to Paris, as you can follow on the map that we saw before. In the meantime, the little group surrounding Napoleon and Napoleon himself came to the conclusion that the best thing to do was indeed for Napoleon to resign and go to the United States. His Majesty, says Gourgaud, proposed to me to go with him, and I accepted immediately. Finally, Napoleon reached Paris, went to the Élysée, the equivalent of the Capitol in Washington, but was received coolly. It can be expected. Still, in the streets there were heard the shouts of "Vive l'Empereur! Hail the Emperor!" At this point, uncertain about just everything except for the idea of going to America, Napoleon and company decided to go to the castle of Malmaison, can you see here, which belonged to none else than Josephine de Beauharnais, who was the first wife of Napoleon, and they decided to wait there for the passport for the United States. Now, in the next historical sketch, we will follow Napoleon from Paris to the coast, and we will find out how and why, instead of traveling to the United States, Napoleon ended up in the island of St. Helena. And this, which you see here, is the house in St. Helena in which Napoleon and his small court lived from 1815 to 1821. All of which, that is, Napoleon's vicissitudes and fate, prove the truth of what Shakespeare had a character say in Hamlet: "Our wills and fates do so contrary run, that our devices still are overthrown. Our thoughts are ours, their ends none of our own." Until next time, this is Jimmy Moldia for Historical Sketches.